Gordon mentioned, as Gordon mentioned, I work for Portland Audubon. I'm on the conservation team there. So I really came to this issue of studying light pollution from a bird conservation perspective. We started surveying downtown buildings for collision evidence. This is in the Portland area back in 2008, 2009. And I started learning the contributing factor that light pollution was to this issue of collisions. And pretty soon I learned that this was a much, much bigger issue than just having an impact on migrating birds. This light pollution impacts entire ecosystems. It divorces us as humans from our deep cultural connection to the stars. It impacts our health, it impacts our safety, and it's a growing issue on the planet. So I'm going to talk a fair bit tonight about research on birds, but I'm also going to talk about other species, including human impacts, and hopefully build a case for preserving the stars that you all get on board with if you're not already. As humans, we really tend to think a lot more about daytime because we're generally diurnal. We tend to think of the night as exotic and far away. We may even be afraid of darkness. But hopefully tonight, I'm going to get us thinking about the beauty and the mystery of the night and about darkness as actual habitat and as a natural resource that has economic value as well as natural resource value. So for 4.5 billion years, there was no artificial light on this planet, and all biological systems evolved under these regular cycles of dark nights and bright days. And that set up all of our biological processes to be governed by those light-dark cycles. This is effectively our master clock on Earth, and it drives our circadian rhythms, which then in turn drive things like sleeping, eating, foraging, migration in some animals, breeding, in plants, flowering and leaf drop and bud burst and things like that. You name it, if it's a biological process, it has a connection to circadian rhythms. And prior to the introduction of artificial light on the planet, people would have slept under a sky full of stars like this one every clear night of the year. Obviously in Oregon, especially in Western Oregon, we have a lot more cloudy nights. But here's where we are today. This is a NASA satellite photo from 2011, and I think this does a really good job of illustrating how in the last 130 years or so, we've really started to light the night on a global scale, starting with the introduction of city streetlights. And today, most humans actually live in urban or suburban areas where we're awash in light all the time, from streetlights, from billboards, sports field lighting, security lighting, often empty parking lots in the middle of the night. And when we light the night like this, we're interrupting those circadian rhythms that I just talked about in ourselves, as well as in birds and mammals and fish and amphibians, reptiles, even in plants. And this is how we get there. So all of that light that's visible from that satellite imagery, this is what that looks like on the ground. We have a real tendency to light our nights with fixtures that are not designed well. They're poorly aimed, they're unshielded, they point up or they point out, they're too bright, they're on when we're not even using them. This is classic. I don't know if you see a lot of this in Bend or further east, but this is a photo of an empty parking lot in Portland. This is a very common sight that we see, and uplit billboards, of course. So all of this light, this isn't benign. This has serious consequences for the planet. And it really speaks to the need for us to keep light on the ground where we need it, rather than throwing it up into the sky where we're not using it. I want to introduce you all to the Bortle scale if you haven't seen it before. This is a tool that was developed in 2001 to help amateur astronomers compare the relative quality of darkness at their observation sites and the interference of light pollution at those sites. So the scale ranges from a 1 excellent dark sky site over here on the right to an 8 or a 9 inner city sky on the left. And if you read this scale from the right to the left, you can obviously follow the gradual loss of star visibility as light pollution increases. Now, if you're in the Bend area, which probably a lot of you are, you're here at about a 7, as well as Roseburg and Redmond. So you still have some stars. You have something left to preserve here. If you're in Burns or Sisters or John Day or Lakeview, you're at that suburban rural transition. And then if you get out to the Alvord or Steens Mountain or Hart Mountain or Summer Lake, you're really at this world-class, excellent dark sky site. This is a shot from the New World Atlas of Artificial Night Sky Brightness, which was released in 2016. It's actually a global map of light pollution based on infrared imaging. And this is just a snapshot of the United States and then zoomed in here on Oregon. The warmer colors, much like the Bortle scale that we just saw in the last photo, warmer colors like red and orange and white indicate higher light pollution. Cooler colors and darker areas like black indicate less light pollution. So this illustrates a pretty staggering picture of the extent of light pollution in the United States. And you can see that west of the Mississippi, we're in better shape than folks are east of the Mississippi, but we still have plenty of light pollution. And when the researchers who developed these maps overlaid this with population data, they found that 99% of people in the United States live under light polluted skies, and 80% of people can't see the Milky Way from home. So that's pretty sobering, right? I also want to point out this black area in southeastern Oregon. You may have heard this before. This represents the largest intact area of class 1 dark skies in the lower 48. So this is a really incredible resource that we have right here in our home state, and for many of you, very close to home. And it's so much easier to preserve dark skies while you still have them than to try to restore them once you've lost them. So I always recommend going for the preservation route rather than the restoration route. Most folks, I'm sure, are well aware that we are in an era of conversion from high pressure sodium to LED. LEDs are incredible. They're energy efficient, they're long lived, and they are very low maintenance. But the conversion from high pressure sodium to LED was supposed to reduce global light pollution. And unfortunately, that's not what's happening. Research is demonstrating that we're still seeing light pollution grow at an average rate of 2% per year. In some places, it's growing much faster than that, including places in Oregon. And that's in part because LEDs are so inexpensive that they get overused. So people tend to think, oh, it's so inexpensive to run these, I can just use a whole lot more light. And also in part because we tend to use a kind of LED that produces blue rich white light. Now, not all the LEDs produce this kind of light, but many early generation LEDs did, and we continue to use those. So these blue rich white light LEDs, they mimic daylight. And that's great during the day, but this is the kind of light that you actually don't want to be exposed to at night. It scatters more readily than longer wavelength light, and it emits this spike in the blue portion of the spectrum. So this is the spectral output of a 4,000 Kelvin LED bulb. Now, not all 4,000 Kelvin LED bulbs will have a spectral output that looks exactly like this, but they'll be similar. And they will generally have this blue spike here. And that happens to be in the peak sensitivity area for birds, mammals, amphibians, fish, and humans. So basically all vertebrates are going to be really sensitive to this kind of light. And what this does is it suppresses melatonin secretion in vertebrates, which is exactly what makes it hard for us to sleep, and then has a whole cascade of other impacts. The American Medical Association put out a report in 2016 warning that this kind of light may increase the risk of certain kinds of cancer, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease in humans, and also produces dangerous glare that may end up causing retinal damage. So Definitely not the kind of light that we want to be using at night. And unfortunately, we see this specked all too often in outdoor projects. There is a whole area of research now on something called ecological light pollution. And this is this growing field of study. Ecosystems are so incredibly complex. And when we introduce artificial light at night to those systems, this very eons long careful choreography of biological life is unfortunately jeopardized. Night is actually habitat for all bats, 90% of amphibians, 70% of mammals, believe it or not, 60% of invertebrates. And all of these nocturnal species are incredibly highly adapted to darkness. So when we introduce light at night, we can confuse celestial navigation in animals that are moving at night. We can either cause disorientation or misorientation in movements of these creatures at night. In some cases, we're attracting animals. In other cases, we're actually repelling them. We're impacting predator-prey relationships. We may be extending the activity of diurnal species into nighttime hours because they're taking advantage of light at night. And we're also skewing the timing of all of these circadian rhythm-driven processes like breeding, nesting, migration, foraging, and plants bud burst and leaf drop. So those things that I've already mentioned. And there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of peer-reviewed published research papers on the impacts of light pollution. Everything from looking at species level impacts to ecosystem level impacts. And absolutely none of it is good news. It's all bad news. And this is just a very tiny sample. But the widespread impacts of light pollution at this point are very well documented. And there's more research happening all the time. Okay, so let's talk about some specific impacts. Bird migration. You all probably know that there are about 630 terrestrial species of birds in North America, and about 70% of those are migratory. Most of those birds actually migrate at night, even if they're diurnal species. So this includes things like warblers, thrushes, sparrows, siskins, kinglets, grosbeaks, and they're migrating at night because the atmosphere is less turbulent. They can avoid their diurnal predators. They preserve those daytime hours so that they can actually do some foraging, and they're also using the stars to navigate. So this is a real generalization, but they'll take off about 30 to 45 minutes after sunset. They'll orient as far as we understand using the North Star or Polaris, and then either Orion or the Big Dipper, and they'll fly all night if conditions are good. And I just want to mention they do have redundant systems. So they are also using polarization of the Earth's magnetic field. They're also in some cases following topographical cues on the landscape. So stars are not the only way that they're navigating, but this is definitely a primary way that they're navigating. And when they come into areas where there is light pollution, they get into trouble because the stars that they're using to navigate are drowned out and they become disoriented. The other thing is that all these diurnal birds that are migrating are actually phototaxic. So they are attracted to light, much like you or I, if we were plunked down in the middle of a dark forest. If we saw light in the distance, we would more than likely move toward it because we would be drawn to that light. So you can see here in this left-hand photo, this is a photo of the tribute in light in Lower Manhattan. All of these white lines and dots that you see going up into the sky in these spires of lights, these are birds that are actually entrapped in the light and they're just circling. And these spires actually reach 4 kilometers up into the sky. So it's a really long reach that these have. And these are illuminated one night a year, September 11th. They have been since 2002. And New York City Audubon folks started noticing birds being entrapped in this light, and they negotiated to have the lights turned off when critical thresholds of birds get entrapped in the light. And they started doing research on this, so they're collecting data. In 2008, I think was the first year that they were doing this, and they're using radar technology to track birds. So if I can turn your attention up here to the upper right-hand corner of the screen, here's our key. This is density of birds. Cooler colors over here are low. low density. Warmer colors over here are high density. So if we look up here to this top panel, this indicates that the tribute lights are off. It's September 12th at 2:12 a.m. And the radar is indicating there are about 500 birds within half a kilometer of the tribute and lights. Now, if we look to this next one, it's 2:32 a.m. 20 minutes later, the tribute lights are on. Look at the color of this radar now. There are an estimated 15,700 birds within a half a kilometer of the spires just 20 minutes later. So it goes from 500 birds to 15,700 birds. So researchers basically found that when the spires lit, birds were aggregating in the area, and when the spires went dark, birds dispersed. And this is not a new phenomenon. It's bird aggregation at lights has been documented since the 1800s at lighthouses and at airport ceilingometers that would measure the height of the clouds since about the 1950s. This is obviously a very uncommon amount of light, but it provides really irrefutable evidence about birds being drawn off their migratory courses and trapped in this light. This is the Standard Insurance Building in Galveston, Texas, and maybe folks remember this got a lot of media attention. In the spring of 2017, 398 birds collided with this building while it was illuminated. All but 3 died, and the 3 that survived were taken to rehab. And the building subsequently turned out its lights, many of its lights, for the remainder of migration season. So obviously you can see this is nowhere near the amount of light of the tribute and lights, and yet it was still a hazard to birds that were on their migratory pathways. And the question is, does it matter? Well, we know from intense research from many, many decades now that up to 1 billion birds die every year as the result of hitting a window. And that puts collisions among the top 3 conservation issues for birds after habitat destruction and cats, which are the top 2. But this is number 3, collisions with windows. And light pollution is a contributing factor, as I've hopefully just demonstrated. So they're more exposed to collision risk when light pollution is also a factor in the area. We also know from a paper that came out of Cornell, published in 2019, that we've lost almost 30% of our North American migratory birds in the last 50 years, so since 1970. So our birds are absolutely in trouble. This is a huge red flag. And light pollution is a relatively easy issue for us to solve. Glass is a harder one, honestly, even though there are solutions, but light pollution is relatively easy. There are also tools that are helping us intentionally reduce light pollution, particularly during migration seasons. So researchers are using radar, again, to track movements of birds on migration and to alert folks to peak movement nights. Bird migration, as you all probably know, is even longer than 3 months in spring and 3 months in fall. I mean, migration takes forever when you think about early migrants and late migrants and everybody in between. But most of the birds that pass over Oregon during their migration season will pass over in a 1-month period. And that's approximately mid-April to mid-May in the spring and approximately mid-September to mid-October in the fall. So we can really focus our efforts. If all we care about is bird migration, we can really focus our efforts. So this is a lights out alert from Colorado State University's Aero Eco Lab. And they post red, orange, and yellow alerts that signal us to relatively large movements of birds. Generally, with red alerts, there are only about 10 per season. And these are sent out when the researchers expect there to be more than 50% of the total expected movement for that day or that night passing over. The objective is to get people to turn off their unnecessary lights, at least during these peaks of spring and fall migration, and absolutely on these red and orange alert nights. This alert here was from May 5th last spring, when there was a movement of 7.3 million birds predicted to fly over Oregon in a single night. So this triggered a red alert for the entire state. So this is a really incredible resource for those of us that are trying to get folks to turn lights off during migration season. This is some really interesting research on flight calling in some bird species. So there are some species, not all, that tend to talk to each other a lot while they're migrating. So maybe some folks have gone out during migration season to listen for Swainson's thrushes flying over at night. They classically do these flight calls. The understanding is that these likely evolved to facilitate collective decision-making for birds on their migration pathways. And so researchers in the Midwest looked at a 40-year record of 70,000 nighttime songbird collisions in Chicago and Cleveland, all fatal. And they found that 93 of the 93 total species in the collection, the species that are known to use these migratory flight calls were overrepresented in the data set. And they were dubbed then super colliders. What's happening is that birds that are using these migration calls are getting into lit areas, and they're starting to call to each other, and they are inadvertently luring other birds into the area to their death by using those calls. Now, this text is fairly small, and they're also in Latin. But right here at the top, white-thrown sparrow is one of the top super colliders, and then dark-eyed junco. Others in this list that we see on the West Coast: song sparrow, hermit thrush, brown creeper, fox sparrow, Swainson's thrush, very common collider, Lincoln sparrow, common yellowthroat, white crowned sparrow. And then a lot of these are also East Coast species that we don't really see here. But these researchers also surveyed collision rates at the nearby Chicago Convention Center, and they found a 75% reduction in collision rate when the lights in the building were turned off. So it is in fact very effective to extinguish lights on a building and thereby reduce collision risk. Excuse me. Let's talk about impacts to predator-prey relationships. So this should be a familiar species to folks, the short-eared owl. So there's been research on short-eared owl predator-prey relationships that show that moonlight really strongly affects both prey behavior and also short-eared owl success at catching their prey. So in controlled settings, owls' hunting effectiveness increases as available light increases, meaning that it takes the owl less time to search for and capture mice as they have more light available to them. But mouse activity is actually suppressed under full moonlight conditions as a predator avoidance strategy. So during full moons, mice actually restrict their movement rates and areas. They forage for shorter periods, and they spend more time in dense vegetation as compared to new moon periods. So when we think about having streetlights out on our landscape that are lit to beyond moonlight level illumination every night of the year, what are we doing to predator-prey relationships? And what are we doing to the survivability of owls, but also the survivability of mice? It's a pretty interesting question. This is some really interesting and pretty sobering research that was done by Meredith Kernbach at the University of South Florida, where she took 50 house sparrows, very common urban species. I'm sure everybody has seen these. And she infected those 50 house sparrows with West Nile virus. And then she separated them into two groups. She had a control group, which was 25 individuals that spent the night in complete darkness. And she had a group of the other 25 that were kept in cages overnight with very dim light, which is what this DLAN stands for, dim light at night. And what the research showed was that the immune systems of the birds in the control group managed to bring the levels of the virus down low enough that they couldn't actually transmit West Nile virus to mosquitoes after 4 days. The birds that had to spend the night under lit conditions stayed infectious for 2 additional days beyond those 4 days of the birds that slept in the darkness. which means that their infectious period with West Nile virus was prolonged, and they were potentially increasing the number of mosquitoes that a sick bird could infect in those additional 2 days. And then the researchers ran a mathematical model, and they found that this could increase West Nile virus outbreak potential by 41%. So West Nile virus, as I'm sure all of you know, is a zoonotic disease, which means that humans can get it too. It can jump between species, and it's not a disease that you want. So this is really pretty sobering when you think about it from a public health standpoint. Relatedly, this is the cover of the 4th National Climate Assessment that came out in 2018. It was produced by a team of 300 federal and non-federal experts that produced this report for Congress. And they included a chapter on the Pacific Northwest. They did chapters for various regions around the United States. But their chapter on the Pacific Northwest indicates that we can expect in the coming years warmer temperatures, more mosquitoes, more West Nile virus, more people getting infected and dying. So if we think about combining this kind of prediction around climate change with something like the research outcomes that I just showed you from that Meredith Kernbach study, we definitely have a very serious potential public health crisis on our hands. So something to think about in terms of the unknown consequences of light pollution that we're just learning about. Okay, let's move away from birds for a few minutes. There's some very cool research done that shows that dung beetles use the Milky Way for orientation. So these guys show up at a dung pile, which is a real melee of competition. They roll a ball of dung, they climb on top of it, they do a little dance, and they take a bunch of snapshots of the night sky. And then they hop off the ball and they manage to roll that ball straight home. Well, researchers found that they could do this in the outdoors under a fully starry sky, and they could also do it if they were moved into a planetarium that only showed them the Milky Way. But basically, if they were in the planetarium and the stars were blotted out, they just went in circles. And if they were in outdoor conditions and they were subjected to wearing these little hats so that they couldn't see the night sky, they also rolled around in circles. Now, they did have controls where they had some transparent hats for some of the dung beetles, and they found that they did just fine. So they were just controlling for whatever impact putting these hats on them might have. But really pretty amazing that we're talking about an insect this big that can use the Milky Way to navigate home. And then, of course, lodestar orientation in harbor seals. So these are animals that travel long distances across the water, potentially without any terrestrial landmarks. And researchers have put them in swimming planetariums and have found that these guys can pick out a lodestar on the horizon, just a single star, and follow it until it drops below the horizon. And then when that one drops out of sight, they already have a second one picked out in line with that one that they can continue to follow. So pretty cool trick if you're a harbor seal. Bats. There are 15 species of bats in Oregon. 15 species of those occur in the Great Basin. And, you know, bats are pretty sadly maligned. I think most people don't really understand them or like them very much, but bats are so cool. These guys are nocturnal and crepuscular, so they're active all night long and also at dusk and dawn. They're well adapted to extremely low light conditions, and they're very beneficial as insect eaters to humans. They can eat over 50% of their body weight in insects in a single night, and a lactating female can in fact eat her entire body weight in insects in a night. And researchers who are looking at bat activity impacted by light pollution have shown that some bats are actually attracted to streetlights, and they'll use those for foraging, particularly around lights that attract large numbers of insects. In fact, they've documented some of the same individuals using the same streetlights night after night, so they get a little bit habituated to this. And California myotis and Yuma myotis are both species that do this. They're attracted to streetlights. The thing is, they are also at higher risk of predation by nocturnal predators when they're doing something like this. They're pretty conspicuous when they're foraging around streetlights. And then there are other bat species like the western pipistrelle, for example, that avoid lights entirely. Lights in the landscape are essentially like a wall in their habitat. So when we're putting up streetlights and other kinds of lighting, we're actually modifying the nighttime environment to the advantage of some bats and to the detriment of others, and then with some untold consequences, because even to the advantage of some of these species, we're putting them at certain risk of predation. And then to just dig a little bit further into this story of insects, so there are some kinds of LEDs, particularly white light LEDs, that attract 48% more insects than their high pressure sodium predecessors. This is an interesting picture that I took in Portland at Timbers Stadium. We don't have a lot of insects in the Portland area. You rarely see something like this. They swapped out all of the old lighting for white light LEDs, and I went to a Timbers game and saw this, and I was very surprised. But essentially what this does is it creates a buffet at these lights that's attracting birds and bats, which isn't good for insects. And concentrating that prey maybe to the benefit of the birds and the bats, but it comes at increased risk of predation for them. And also insects aren't then out doing what they're supposed to be doing, whether they're night pollinating or mating or whatever else. They're concentrated here, and that's not where they're supposed to be. There was a 2017 study out of Germany that showed the biomass of flying insects in an area around Europe have decreased more than 75% in 27 years. And those researchers, when they overlaid their geographic data with their insect decline data, they found evidence for the correlation between light pollution and those declines in insect populations. Other insect researchers are also reporting that they believe there's a credible link between light pollution and the decline in insect populations. And, you know, we may think like, who actually cares about that? But the attraction of insects to lights at night really has much more permanent and widespread impacts than we might immediately think about. Okay, let's talk about human health and impacts to sleep. So humans have these non-image forming cells in our eyes that are sensitive to blue rich white light or daylight, so sunlight essentially. And these actually tell your brain that it is time to wake up when this SCN is stimulated. So through a complex physiological process, blue light hitting these cells, melatonin secretion is suppressed in your system, and that impairs the body from sleeping. So this is the kind of light that's emitted by the sun. It also happens to be emitted by all of our devices. So this is a screenshot of my cell phone and a screenshot taken from my laptop computer. Most of our devices have nightlight settings, and folks probably know about this, but you can actually make a setting. In some cases, they are factory set to on, but this will dial down the blue light that is being emitted by your phone or your computer at night so that you're not sending this kind of message to your brain. Unfortunately, we have a lot of streetlights now that are also emitting this kind of light. As streetlights around the world are getting converted from high pressure sodium to LED. I mentioned already that in 2016, the American Medical Association released a report that indicated that there are certain kinds of cancer and cardiovascular disease and diabetes that may be exacerbated by this kind of light. And they also recommended in that report that when municipalities convert from high pressure sodium to LED, that they minimize the emission of blue rich white light from these sources. So if you are having trouble sleeping at night, I highly recommend that you either talk to your municipality about getting a back shield on the light, or that you get blackout curtains to put on your bedroom windows, because this could very well be contributing to sleepless nights. The CDC, I want to mention, has said that insufficient sleep is linked to the development of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and depression. Now, insufficient sleep is going to be different for everybody, Some people need 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night and they do fine. Other people need 7 or 8 hours of sleep and they do fine. And what I'm talking about here is the interruption of sleep. So something that's actually impairing you from going to sleep. And it could be something like this. This is a study on artificial light at night by the Stanford Sleep Epidemiology Lab. And what they did is they studied the sleep habits of 16,000 people for 8 years. And they found that living in areas with higher outdoor light at night was correlated with falling asleep later for people, decreased total sleep time, lower sleep quality, and symptoms of what they call circadian rhythm disorder. So this is something that people are getting diagnosed with now. And this is a study that was done really before there was a lot of LED being installed in our streetlights. So this is just artificial light at night, not even blue rich white light. I suspect that this same research would probably be even more extreme now that we have blue rich white light out on our streets. One thing that was interesting is that they found that all of these symptoms were consistent in folks that went home and pulled blackout curtains on their windows. So being outside in the evening and exposed to artificial light had an impact on their sleep, even if they could go home and close blackout curtains. So you can't control for everything, I guess. In terms of energy and money, how does this pencil? Well, the International Dark Sky Association crunched numbers from the US Department of Energy from 2011 data, and they estimated that about 35% of light is wasted because it's poorly designed. It's unshielded, or it's poorly aimed and it's ending up in the sky, or it's too bright. A lot of that light just isn't even useful. This translates to $3 billion a year of energy loss and 15 million tons a year of CO2 emissions. So when we are living in a time of very evident climate impacts and climate change, this is really low-hanging fruit to be making sure that we're following best practices in lighting design and not wasting a whole lot of light. And best practices have been developed. So minimizing any unnecessary lighting. So if you're not using it, turn it off. Making sure that fixtures are fully shielded and that they are aimed down. So here's a diagram of that. This is fully shielded and aimed down. Limiting the total brightness, so not using more total light than you need, not using light brighter than you need it to be. Also choosing warm colors. So this gets back to that blue rich white light issue. So choosing a color temperature that's 3000 kelvins or lower. This is not always very clearly marked on light bulb packaging. Sometimes the best you can do is find that it says warm color, but read the fine print. Oftentimes you can find a color temperature and you really want to get under 3000 kelvins. 22 or 2700 kelvins is even better for any kind of exterior light at night. And then using adaptive controls like motion sensors or dimmers or timers. And these are all things that we can do on our home lighting. It's not just for big buildings. These are all good ideas for big buildings, but they're also things that we can do at home. And this is just a really nice schematic, obviously totally unshielded, throwing light in every direction. Still not great. There's a little cap there. This guy has a little bit bigger cap, and then this one is fully shielded. We have to talk about safety and security because this is always one of the very first concerns that gets raised. And I think that we have been indoctrinated to believe that more light equals more safety. And it just isn't that simple. And the data also doesn't bear it out. What we actually need is lighting that is designed better, but not necessarily more lighting. In some cases, we're going to have light deficient areas where we need to add lights, but in some cases, we just need to think about how that lighting can be designed better. So overly bright and direct glare bombs actually just restrict your pupils and make it harder for people to transition into darker areas, especially as the eye ages. So in the aging human eye, we are slower to respond when we move from an overlit area to a darker area. This is a really nice example. Here's a photographer that's looking at a totally unshielded light and taking a photo. And then in this picture, The photographer has raised their hand just to create a makeshift shield on that light. And all of a sudden you can see into the shadows, something you couldn't see here because your light was, or your eyes were subjected to all of this glare, but there's actually a person standing here. So I think that's a really nice illustration of how we design our lighting to be safer for people moving around. There are a lot of studies looking at this. The data is a little bit all over the map. Some of the studies are incredibly skewed, honestly, but I just want to point out these two studies here in the lower right-hand corner. The first is the Chicago Alley Lighting Project from published in 2000. And what they did was they went into alleys in Chicago and they increased the frequency of light poles, and they also increased the total lumens coming off of each of the poles. And then they looked at before and after crime data. And what they found in this study was that crime actually increased 21% in areas where alley lighting was increased in frequency and wattage. Not what we would have expected the outcome to be, given all that we've been told about more lighting equaling more safety, right? Then I've taken a quote from the National Institute of Justice report from 1997, Preventing Crime, What Works, What Doesn't, and What's Promising. And the quote from this research is street lighting an effective approach in the reduction and deterrence of crime? The answer is inconclusive. We have very little confidence that improved lighting prevents crime. And I actually think that what they mean here is increased lighting, not improved lighting, because I'm not sure they went anywhere and technically improved the lighting. I think they just increased it. So pretty interesting. And I think it asks us to rethink our ideas about safety and security and lighting. These are some photos taken from a variety of municipalities. So lower left here is New York City. Again, here in the lower right is New York City. Again, here, New York City in the upper right. This is Amsterdam in the middle photo. This is Houston, a park in Houston in the upper left-hand corner. And I think like the question is, can we design our lighting in our cities and our towns and our parks so that we are simultaneously providing for safety and circulation, and at the same time keeping the light where we need it, when we need it, and keeping it out of the sky? And I think the answer is yes. I think there are a lot of examples of really excellent ambient level lighting that's good for wayfinding, that creates a really nice sense of place, and that provides for safe conditions where lighting is even across the surface that you're walking on and that kind of thing. So I think we need to debunk this idea that we just have to light the hell out of every place in order to have a safe and vibrant space. Certainly if they can do it in New York, we can do it anywhere else, right? These are some headlines that I've taken from places like CNN Travel, the New York Times, Condé Nast, Travel Oregon is in here, the Oregonian is in here. I think Willy Week is represented. Astrotourism and astral photography is this really growing interest area. And I think more and more people are starting to travel to destinations with stargazing and astral photography in mind. So this has a real benefit, a real economic benefit for rural communities. The other thing is that we're seeing more of our land managers like state parks, and the National Park Service has been all over this for a long time, but really recognizing that their land stewardship extends to the sky, and that, you know, National Park Service has a motto, half the park is after dark. So, you know, we think about spaces during the day, but are we thinking about spaces at night too? And also about the availability of our connection to our human cultural heritage of looking at the night sky. So thinking about all of the amazing stargazing locations that we have in Oregon and what it would take to preserve some of these and make sure that they're around in perpetuity. Okay, so before I turn it over to Bill, I'm just going to talk very briefly about things that you can do to help protect your own night skies. First of all, you can evaluate your own home lighting and make sure that it's following those best practices. I think that East Cascades Audubon should now or shortly have some resources online for you to think about how you might do this. If you can't find them there, you can find them at the Portland Audubon website, but hopefully they'll get up on the East Cascades Audubon website soon if they're not there yet. You can join East Cascades Audubon and you can support dark sky protection work that they're doing. You can also join the Oregon chapter of the International Dark Sky Association. And Bill's going to talk about his dark sky quality meter project that's running all over the state, a really cool project that he's working on and something that folks can get involved in. I also want to mention that last year in 2021, what year am I in? They all start to run together in COVID, don't they? Portland Audubon worked with Rep. Hudson to introduce House Bill 3319. This was a light pollution study bill. It actually never got a hearing. There was a massive backlog of bills at the state capitol in this last session, but there's still interest among some senators and representatives. So we are looking to introduce another light pollution study bill, or perhaps even a full Night Sky Protection Act bill in 2023. So be looking for that. And then I want to mention also the Oregon Outback Dark Sky Network. So we are back now to this amazing intact area of Class 1 dark skies in southeastern Oregon. There is a team of folks called the Oregon Outback Dark Sky Network that are working together to preserve dark skies in Lake County and part of Harney County, and maybe soon to be in Harney County as well. In fact, I just attended a stargazing workshop last night that the Friends of the Owyhee did, and they talked about being part of this team working on this. And as you probably know, they're way over here, right in the corner of Malheur County. These folks are hoping to get an International Dark Sky Sanctuary designation for this area. It does not have any legal bearing. There's nothing that says that you can't put a light out once this designation goes into effect. But it would go a long way to elevating astrotourism in the area, to helping people understand what an amazing natural resource this is, getting the word out about that. It would include largely federal and state lands in this area, as well as some small communities that have opted in. I think Plush and Paisley and Ventura may be on that list of communities that are opting into this. And these folks are working on collecting night sky data right now, and they need help doing that. So that's a way that you could plug into this process. Eventually, they're going to need letters of support for this kind of designation of a dark sky sanctuary. They do have a website. They're also on Facebook, so you can find them there if you want to get involved. And with that, Bill, if you will come out of the ether and we will skip to your presentation.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mary. So there'll be time after my presentation to ask questions of Mary and also myself. So my name is Bill Kowalik. I'm the chairperson of the Oregon chapter of IDA, and I happen to live in Bend. So, and Mary, you're going to forward for me. So next slide, please. So the the outline. We decided to combine the slides into one deck so that things would go more efficiently in the turnover. So I'm relying on Mary for mouse control here. So outline, we'll talk a little bit about light pollution, show you some examples from Central Oregon, talk about measuring light pollution in Oregon, both from space, satellite images at night looking down, and from the ground looking up. And we'll talk about an update of the Deschutes County lighting ordinance, which is currently ongoing, and how you can help. Next. So this is a picture taken from the hill above Pine Mountain Observatory, which is about 20 miles southeast of Bend, at night, about 11:30 at night a few years ago, showing light pollution, sky glow above Bend, Redmond, and Prineville. So as Mary pointed out, sky glow is light that escapes from the ground, scatters through the atmosphere, and this picture shows very clearly the kind of glowing that we see in the distance from Pine Mountain looking back toward Central Oregon. And Mary pointed out these statistics earlier. about the waste of energy and excess CO2 emissions as a result of wasted light at night. The next slide shows a similar view. This happens to be from Grizzly Peak, looking down toward the city of Prineville on the left, and the two data centers plus the Les Schwab distribution center up on the plateau above Prineville, all contributing to a significant amount of light pollution. The data centers were under construction at the time, although that construction has been going on, especially at the Facebook data center, for such a long time, and still is. So it's a significant source of light pollution in Central Oregon. So the next slide is a preliminary to talking about measuring light pollution here in Central Oregon. So as I mentioned, imaging from space, looking down at night, and from the ground looking up. And we're looking at two methods. The one we're spending most effort on is one Mary just mentioned, which is the so-called sky quality meter. It's a network of photometers that we have distributed around the state. Next slide. So this is a nighttime satellite image of Central Oregon taken at 1:30 in the morning, April 2018. And the bright spots labeled there, Bend, Redmond, Prineville, are basically lights at night, 1:30 in the morning, that are detected from space from the particular NASA satellite. So you can see over there on the left, Mount Bachelor and down Sun River and Lapine, everybody contributing lights. So now it's possible to take this nighttime satellite image and then convolve it with an atmospheric model, which is what, and Mary showed some of those examples. So if we go to the next slide, we see exactly that. So this is the spread of light caused by scattering in the atmosphere. And if you go back one, Mary, you can see that the actual sources of the light are relatively small or big big as far as the city is concerned, but the effect of that light, as shown in the next slide, expands dramatically because of scattering of light by the atmosphere. So now the next slide is the whole state, and Mary has already shown this, including the large area in the southeast, which is quite an area of pristine night sky that is quite a resource for this state of Oregon. Okay, so the next slide shows back again to Central Oregon, and it shows a satellite image, atmospheric model from October 2014.
We don't seem to be seeing the slides change. At least I'm not.
I am.
I'm seeing them change.
They are changing.
Jim, maybe you need to reload or something. So that the contours here represent a percentage of light from artificial sources above the natural all sky darkness. And so in the lower right corner, you see a little piece of the Oregon outback, and a number there, 1%, meaning that that's a contour boundary for a point where the night sky is 1% brighter than the actual natural sky would be. And you follow those numbers all the way around to Bend in the middle, where we're at 1,000% brighter than the natural sky. So this is October 2014. Now the next slide is 5 years later. Things have expanded. They've gotten worse in those 5 years. And Mary, if you go back and forth a couple of times, you can see where we're going here. And this was, 3 years ago. So one of our projects is to calculate these images with the help of Dan Dorisco, who formerly with the National Park Service, to demonstrate pretty clearly how light pollution is spreading in Central Oregon, in fact, the whole state. So the next slide gets to the point of the measurement of light pollution from the ground. So this is a so-called Oregon Sky Glow Measurement Network, which IDA Oregon, our organization, has started and is running. Each of the yellow stars on here represent a location where we have one of the sky quality meters. So it's a meter that is out in a closed weatherproof container, and it continually takes measurements every 5 minutes for 3 months at a time. Then we and other volunteers go out and change the batteries, basically download the data and then incorporate it into a report. It turns out that the first few of these meters that we purchased and installed were courtesy of ECAS back in 2019 with the support of Mary Ann Cruz, who was the head of Lights Out Bend at the time. We also have support from the City of Sisters Astronomy Club, Jim Hammond and company. And of course, it turns out the Travel Southern Oregon is providing those sensors and data for the ones that you see in the Oregon Outback, the lower right corner of the map. So we have about 17 volunteers around the state working on this. And in fact, this coming weekend, we're headed over to Eugene to install 3 more. We have gaps in the Willamette Valley and along the coast. So and the rest of Oregon for that matter to the east. So we're soliciting support to buy and install such meters. And we're doing this for a couple of reasons. First of all, the federal government, state government, city and county people do not measure light pollution. So we've taken upon ourselves to show how it can be done. In fact, I might say that we're among the world leaders in doing this and analyzing the data. And so the data are used for 2 reasons. One is to help areas like parks, like Wallowa Lake State Park and Cottonwood Canyon State Park, to get certified as dark sky parks. You may be aware that Prineville Reservoir State Park, more or less right in the middle of the map, is currently the only certified dark sky park in Oregon. And also, as somebody pointed out in the chat, Sun River is a certified community, basically. So we have several, and the other reason, in addition to tracking how dark it is, we're tracking how light pollution changes over time. So the next slide shows a box plot with the vertical axis being the brightness of the night sky as measured by our meters out across Oregon. On the left, the lower left, it's darker, and the upper left, sort of the upper part of the diagram, it's brighter. And each one of those meters, as you can see, the observatory in the upper left corner is, in fact, the brightest place that we've measured so far in Oregon. I expect as soon as we get some meters over in Portland, then those will be, in fact, much brighter, and the observatory will look relatively dark by comparison. And if you go down to the lower right here, we see the sites that Mary talked about, like Summit Lake, Malheur Field Station, Hart Mountain in the Oregon Outback. Those are essentially as dark as you can get. Pristine night skies. Okay, so next slide shows recent results of the estimated annual change of sky glow in Central Oregon from this monitoring network. And so the 2 locations we have directly in Bend at the Observatory and on Aubrey Butte, we're seeing a 10% increase in light pollution per year. Mary pointed out that globally we expect 2% per year. Here we have 5 times that. Population's increasing, lighting ordinances are not being enforced, lighting ordinances need to be improved. Okay, next slide. So in Deschutes County, due to efforts of folks in the dark sky support community here in Central Oregon, last year sent a lot of emails into Deschutes County commissioners requesting to update the 1994 lighting ordinance. Now it's happening. It's currently in the Deschutes County Planning Commission. I must point out that this applies only to the county, not to the cities of Bend, Redmond, or Sisters. So this 1994, 26-year-old ordinance needs to be updated because, as Mary pointed out, we have new lighting technology, which leads to overlighting. We have new understanding of the negative impact of light pollution on people in the wild ecosystem. New understanding of the impact of color of light. Blue light at night is a very bad idea. And we have so many more outdoor lights, and ordinances are not being supported. So next slide, the Planning Commission of the Deschutes County is forming a panel of like 6 to 8 people to provide input on this lighting ordinance. And it's happening pretty quickly, actually. And they expect people from these 6 and possibly more subdivisions of the community to provide input. IDA, I volunteered for that position. Astronomers, Audubon Society, perhaps somebody from this group has already been contacted by Deschutes County. If not, we should probably talk about it. Next Planning Commission coming up is on February 10th, and that is the first meeting where this group is supposed to meet on Zoom in order to provide some input to the Planning Commission. It's my experience from the last couple of meetings attended that the Planning Commission itself is quite supportive of upgrading the 1994 lighting ordinance. However, staff is much less convinced because they don't have the people to go out and check lights, and they're more inclined to just focus, I think, on education. Education is fine, but without a stick to enforce some ordinance, then it'll be more like business as usual, and dramatic increase in light pollution as we go forward with adverse impact on the ecosystem. So last slide is what you can do. Email the Deschutes County Commissioners and the planning staff and Planning Commission that you support a strong update to the county lighting ordinance, not just a educational aspect. That's a valuable part, but we need to put some stronger rules in as well and have them enforced. Some other things you can do here, which we have mentioned in passing, including joining the International Dark Sky Association, and it's like $35 a year. And after you join, you're automatically a member of the Oregon chapter. So that's all I had then, Gordon. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Bill and Mary. I don't see any questions in the chat that you haven't covered yet, but if anyone wants to chime in, unmute yourself and ask a question.
Okay, I have my hand up in that reaction. Okay, thanks, Mary and Bill, for that, for those presentations. I'm curious about the, as I was saying, for some reason, my images weren't advancing on your slides. But I do have a question about the one that had the dark sky meter, the sky quality meters. You had green spots and you had little sun-like spots. What was the difference between those locations?
Yeah, Jim, the green spots on the map were possible locations with people we've talked to at various state parks and other locations, whereas the yellow stars were existing meters recording data.
And those are places where your latest results of your analysis include the ones at those sites. Because what I want to mention is that, and you know this, of course, Bill, but we have a sky quality meter on Grizzly Mountain, basically looking, well, of course, it looks straight up, but it's at an elevation that the property owner there sent a picture looking across, basically across Prineville to the rim rock on the other side, and you can see those same lights. So we have that one, which we call Grizzly Peak or Grizzly Mountain or something like that. And we also have one you showed Crooked River Ranch, and we have Downtown Sisters and the Rimrock Ranch, which we've had for quite a while. And those are units that were purchased by the Sisters Astronomy Club. we are part of the Sisters Park and Recreation District, which is really somewhat, in some sense, separate. As people who live in Sisters know, it's a different funding source and all that from the city of Sisters. But I want to mention that I could contact you separately, but I've been thinking about an all-sky camera for installation out at the Rimrock Ranch. And of course, you know where that is. And the question is, are those the kind of locations, which is a pretty dark location, as your chart shows? Rimrock Ranch is in the darker, well, it doesn't get over to southeastern Oregon.
Yeah, Jim, that would be a perfect location. So let's talk offline about that. I like the idea.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks a lot, guys.
Gary Whitaker?
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you so much. While you were talking about night sky, the city of San Jose, when I lived down that way, had a streetlight effort to make sure that they didn't pollute the sky there, particularly for the Lick Observatory, I guess, is part of the reasoning. I don't know if their city model is something that could be looked at as a way of encouraging cities to adopt a similar system of making sure at least the streetlights are shielded. The city of San Jose was pretty adamant about that and did a pretty good job of it in my mind. And I was going to also mention there's a group, some of them are on this call, are going to the Cottonwood Canyon State Park to camp out for a few days. And one of the incentives is the night sky there. So thanks.
That's great to hear. You can see the dark sky quality meter that's out there installed by one of our other board members. Yeah, Gary, I think you bring up a really good point about the city of San Jose. I don't know exactly where they landed, but I know that they did have a lot of public outcry about the LED conversion they were doing, and that they did at least consider a course correction. I think they went with a lower Kelvin temperature streetlight than they had originally intended to go with. And I think it is always really important when you're advocating for a city ordinance that you find a like-sized city. You know, if I'm advocating for a new lighting ordinance in the city of Portland and I point to Sisters, which may have an amazing ordinance, the city of Portland isn't actually going to follow that. So I think it's really good to find a city that has a similar population size, that demonstrates a similar level of density and traffic and potential conflict areas, and then say, if they can do a lighting ordinance, here's something we could base ours on. Yeah, good thinking.
This is Sherry. I didn't put my hand up, but I think Marianne Cruz has left the group, but she did start in Bend, the Lights Out Bend, which then transitioned into the Dark Skies, which you guys, and on our website, the ECAS website, under projects, there is still a link from the Lights Out Bend to Dark Skies. So anybody who missed that link, you could easily go to the ECAS website and find that under projects. But the other thing I wanted to mention, what Marianne did when it was Lights Out Bend, she did work within the city of Bend and got quite a few partners to reduce their lighting. As you said, that committee is going to be a county committee, which isn't going to be the cities where we really need it. So,
well, actually, it's very true, Sherry. The city contributes, the cities here, Bend in particular, contribute the most light pollution, but the city of Bend, in my experience, is currently pretty involved with other issues like homeless and transportation. And we haven't heard any inklings of getting involved again with the lighting ordinance, but we certainly could use that kind of support again, now that this group that evolved from Lights Out Bend is actually covering the whole state of Oregon. We're spread pretty thin, so we do need a lot of local people on the ground, especially in Bend in Central Oregon here, to help with those kinds of issues. It would be wonderful.
We have Maggie and Tom and your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. Great presentations, really well done. Thank you. I learned a great deal. My question is around what you brought up, Mary, about the CO2 emissions and how that is definitely low-hanging fruit as we talk about the problems with climate change. I'm wondering if how much that has been pushed with folks that have power and are trying to work on that problem as just kind of a side issue, which might benefit everyone in terms of the dark sky issue.
Yeah, I think that the issue of light pollution is becoming central to a lot more of these challenges that we face simultaneously. And I think you're right. I think light pollution has been considered kind of a piddly issue compared to so many other pressing issues in this moment in time. But I think that more and more people are recognizing that there's a multiple bottom line here. It's good for human health, it's good for energy savings, it's good for ecosystems. It's just good for so many reasons. Why not make this part of the set of considerations that we're looking at in order to address climate change? And we're going to have to do a lot of different things. Obviously, switching out all of our lighting has an upfront cost, but in many cases, just turning lights off that are unnecessary is a great start. Or putting timers on lights, especially with the introduction of new LEDs. I mean, these things come with all kinds of bells and whistles that can be accompanied with them. So timers and dimmers and sensors, that kind of thing. I mean, I don't think that it made it into the infrastructure bill, for example, which it certainly could have. But I think there are ways that arguments can be made at the local level that this is a component of some of our other objectives.
Good point. Thanks.
If I might make a comment, I recently had a communication with a guy named Pete Strasser, who's a lighting engineer at International Dark Sky Association in Tucson, the headquarters, about the carbon footprint of lights that are left on all night. And so we did a calculation that showed that a parking lot with like 25 lights, 150 watts, which is not very much, but LEDs, don't require that much wattage. Burning all night long would would have the carbon footprint equal to a sort of a modern American house. It was I forget the number, like 15,000 pounds of CO2. And if you turn those lights off for half the night, say after 11 p.m., you'd save half of a household of carbon footprint just in one parking lot. So that I was getting to the idea of, to answer the question, I think there is a lot of support to be gained by people who are concerned about carbon footprint and climate change and reducing lights at night.
The whole Ben Green initiative, or I forget what they're calling it, but it seems to me that they would really be interested in putting that on their agenda to add.
Yeah, we provided input to them early on, not specifically these numbers that I just mentioned, but we never heard back from an email that we sent to that climate committee. It was very frustrating.
Send the Dovers, because I think that would get their attention. I would send the numbers. Yeah, great. Okay. Thank you.
I do think there are plenty of climate action plans out there that do include some language about reducing light pollution, but rarely do they have metrics or, really goalposts that are measurable. So I think that's the next step.
One more hand raised. Bonnie Campbell, you still have a question or comment?
Question. Since the bottom line is always important to companies, has anyone gone out to talk to whoever the managers are out of those call centers in Prineville and show them some numbers of how they could save and also be a better neighbor or partner with the community if they reduce their lighting?
Well, it's a good question, Bonnie. It's been on a list for some time. We need some volunteers to actually do it. It's a great idea.
Well, I don't feel qualified to do it, but
we have people who are involved in IT, high tech, and they have some credibility in that environment. So perhaps if not people on this call, folks
Yeah, I would think they could show to corporate what a hero they are by showing how they could reduce their costs. But thank you.
And
Great
carbon
presentation.
footprint. Yeah.
It would be interesting to see too what their lighting looks like post-construction, because obviously a lot of construction lighting is just abysmal. And you know, if that's their permanent lighting, I would just think neighbors would be up in arms about that. So hopefully their lighting looks better today than it did under construction circumstances, but it's definitely seems like it's worth looking into.
Yeah, their neighbors are themselves. They're kind of out there alone.
Mm.
Yeah, it would be the Les Schwab. That would be the one that maybe hasn't changed because they've never been under construction up there. They just operate 24/7.